Welcome back to Citadel Station. We hope your somnolent healing stage went well. Today is the 6th day of November, year 2072. You are currently in the healing suites located on the first level.
You've awoken from coma on a space station, and everyone is dead. Hideous mutants and mechanical monstrosities stalk the hallways. A biological contaminant is running wild. And yet your biggest threat is the station herself. And the only question that matters is how will you survive? What's up, everybody? I'm Kirk, and today we are delving into a legend, an innovative game far ahead of its time that would solidify a captivating genre built on player choice. That's right, today we're talking about System Shock. But before we get lost in the systems, if you're new here and you're digging what you're seeing, please consider liking and subscribing to help support this channel. Alrighty, let's begin.
We hope you have a pleasant stay on Citadel Station.
System Shock was originally released in 1994. It was developed by Looking Glass Technologies and published by Electronic Arts. If you're unfamiliar with Looking Glass, they were easily one of the most influential game studios of the 1990s, and arguably one of the most influential game studios of all time. Those familiar might remember them fondly for their foundational contributions to the stealth genre, with the Thief games. Some might remember them more for their canon of respected flight sims. And a few of you might remember them for developing the Genesis version of Madden 93. Yeah, there's a random piece of trivia for you. But Looking Glass's biggest contribution to gaming was their pioneering of the immersive simulation, or immersive sim. If you've never heard of immersive sims, it's understandable if the first thing that pops into your head is something like this. But in truth, immersive sims are more like this. Actually, scratch that. They're really closer to this. Immersive sims present a non-linear, reactive world governed by simulated systems, in which the player has total agency in how they use these systems in order to accomplish their goals. The result being a wholly unique experience for the player. A simpler way to put it is that these games give the player total freedom, or total freedom within some limitations, to play however they want. There's no right or wrong way to approach an immersive sim. Think of it like this. A traditional action video game, something like Call of Duty, is a developer-driven experience. There's only one way to progress, and everything that happens to them is by the developer's design. It's like a theme park ride. Lots of thrills, but the track can only go one way. For immersive sims, think of them more like a sandbox. The developer has simulated this sandbox and put a whole bunch of toys in it. From there, the developer takes a back seat and lets the player drive the experience, using the toys in the toy box however they want. The point is, the developer doesn't care how you play in the sandbox, as long as you're having fun and crafting a unique experience for yourself. Another major aspect of these games is the concept of emergent gameplay. Mechanics that come about from player experimentation within the simulation. Mechanics often not planned by the developer. Now, what I've given you is a pretty truncated explanation of a genre and gameplay philosophy that is a little tricky for some to wrap their head around. And if you're confused or would like to know more, I highly recommend Mark Brown's video covering the subject. I'll go ahead and pop it in the description. It's a great watch. But just keep these things in mind. Simulated environments, player agency, emergent gameplay, unique experiences. Looking Glass first practiced the immersive sim concept with the 1992 cult classic Ultima Underworld: The Stygian Abyss, a spin-off of the long-running fantasy RPG series Ultima that placed players in a massive underground dungeon where they must rescue a kidnapped princess. Following Underworld's 1993 sequel, Labyrinth of Worlds, the Looking Glass team, burned out from their lives revolving around swords and sorcery, were eager to further explore their unique gameplay style with a totally different setting, one that would take them out of the dark, damp underground and into the stars. System Shock's development team was a who's who of gaming juggernauts. whether you've heard of them or not. The game was produced by Warren Spector, best known for going on to create the Deus Ex series. Doug Church was the director, who, on top of being involved with other Looking Glass games like Thief, became what I would call a game design mercenary, having lent his talents not only to Deus Ex, but also the early Crystal Dynamics Tomb Raider games. He had a stint at Valve as well. The game's composer was Greg Lopiccolo, who went on to direct the first Thief game and then eventually ended up at a little company called Harmonix, where he would direct the influential rhythm game Frequency and its better-known sequel, Amplitude. And finally, the game's physics were programmed by one Seamus Blackley, who is better known as the father of the Xbox. Welcome to Looking Glass. Everyone there was amazing. When it was finally released, System Shock was critically adored, with its players gushing over its innovations and chilling story. And even today, it is still regarded as a huge leap forward, not only in immersive sims, but first-person gaming in general. And while the game sold decently, it ultimately was a financial failure for Looking Glass, an outcome that has cursed the genre ever since its inception. Despite the financial disappointment, a sequel would eventually come. Ken Levine, a young designer at Looking Glass who helped write the original Thief, left the company in 1997 to establish his own development studio in Boston, Massachusetts. That company was Irrational Games, and despite the split from Looking Glass, the company's first project would be in cooperation with them, developing System Shock 2. System Shock 2 dropped in 1999, and let me tell ya, people really liked System Shock 2, like considered to be one of the greatest games of all time liked, improving on the original in just about every aspect and bringing immersive sims forward tremendously. Sadly though, the curse would continue. System Shock 2, despite critical and fan praise, was a sales disappointment, a frustrating outcome that would dash hopes for a sequel and keep immersive sims firmly in the realm of niche. Irrational would trek on though, and in the following years developed several quality titles. However, in 2006, Irrational would take another crack at an immersive sim, this time a spiritual successor to System Shock called BioShock, which took much of the fundamental design of System Shock 2, along with its story, and set it in an underwater city circa 1960, where Randian politics have turned people into raving mutated lunatics. Okay, so people really liked System Shock 2, but people really liked BioShock. And praise be to Atlas, it was a commercial hit, sparking a beloved franchise that includes 2 sequels, both of which gamers have a lot of opinions on. I would also credit BioShock for sparking the second, painfully slow-burning wave of immersive sims that we enjoy today. Oh, but fret not, this was not the end for our System Shock. The success of BioShock brought renewed interest in the Shock games, certainly from gamers, but also developers. One developer in particular, Nightdive Studios, after going through some minor legal loop-de-loops, would manage to update and re-release System Shock 2 for digital storefronts, and soon after remastered the original game for modern hardware, which is the version we are looking at today. Nightdive is also putting the finishing touches on a full remake which is slated to release towards the end of 2021. System Shock 3 is also in development. Maybe. Otherside Entertainment, a studio formed by Looking Glass founder Paul Neurath, was developing Shock 3, with Warren Spector directing, a scenario most would consider best case. They got to the point where gameplay trailers were starting to be shown, but the project hit a flurry of development issues, resulting in Otherside selling the rights for System Shock 3 to Tencent, who are currently developing the project with Otherside advising. Unfortunately, since the sale, there hasn't been much news on the project. System Shock takes place in the cyberpunk future of 2072. You play a nameless hacker who one night decides to do what he does best and infiltrates the system of the Tri-Optimum Corporation. He gets caught. Facing certain legal punishment, the hacker is approached by Tri-Optimum executive Edward Diego, who makes the hacker an offer. He requests the hacker accompany him to Citadel Station, a Tri-Optimum facility dedicated to medical and robotics research orbiting Saturn. Once there, Edward wants the hacker to reprogram the station AI so that he will be able to access sensitive files incriminating the executive of illegal experiments. If the hacker pulls this off, all charges will be dropped, and he will be given a state-of-the-art state-of-the-art military interface, basically a chip inserted into the brain. The hacker agrees. I mean, who could turn down such an offer? He travels to Citadel, carries out the job, and once successful, is outfitted with the interface mod. A surgery that brings with it a 6-month coma for recovery. 6 months pass, the hacker awakens, and finds that something has gone very, very wrong. With his new interface mod and a pipe he discovered in the closet, he sets out from the medical bay to certain horror. System Shock's gameplay revolves around 3 pillars: exploration, combat, and puzzle solving. The player interacts with the world within 2 modes: a standard free-looking, free-roaming one where you can carry out basic mechanics like movement, jumping, and attacking, and a stationary detective mode where the player moves the cursor around on screen, able to interact with the environment like picking up objects and use various HUD menus, not unlike a point-and-click adventure game. Many have compared playing System Shock to playing an operating system, and I gotta say, the joke still checks out. This stems from the game's vast, multifunctional HUD that provides various menus the player will need to succeed. By default, the game is presented within this cybernetic-looking border, with the game world kept in a claustrophobic window, likely representing the hacker's military interface. However, you can easily switch to a full-screen view, which was definitely my preference. In the bottom center of the screen are various tabs that represent your core menus: inventory, cybernetic hardware, etc. In the 2 bottom corners are 2 other tabbed menus that are identical to each other, where a map can be pulled up, weapons information, target information, and once again, inventory. And it's up to the player to choose which menus they leave up at all times. For me, I liked having my map at the bottom left and my weapon loadout on the opposite side. For the rest of the HUD, you have your health readout and energy, along with these buttons right here that activate your cybernetic abilities. The reasons Looking Glass went with this beefy HUD was for immersion and flexibility. They wanted the player to always be connected to the game world and not have their immersion broken by going into separate menus. The only times the player is disconnected from the world is when they look at the full map or enter cyberspace. Looking Glass's hearts were in the right place with this, but System Shock is a great example of why modern video game HUDs are the way they are. You know, simple and approachable. The problem with the HUD is that it hits you with a lot of stuff right off the bat, and it can make the early hours of the game rather frustrating just trying to wrap your head around it. In fact, this brings me to what is the biggest issue with playing System Shock today. It's a pain in the ass to get into, not only because of the HUD, but also the controls. A funny thing about System Shock is that most of the game can be played with just the mouse, with just about every gameplay mechanic represented on screen with some sort of button. You can do all forms of movement, crouching, leaning around corners, even looking up and down, by interacting with this little dude right here. That's all well and good, but playing on keyboard is more of an obstacle. The default key settings are rather complicated and rather uncomfortable for a contemporary player, with some of the simplest actions needing multiple keystrokes. Reloading, for example, is done by hitting Alt Backspace. Luckily, you can remap the keys, and I highly recommend anyone who plays this to take the time to do so. And here's the thing, I'm referring to the most recent enhanced version of the game. The original version, now referred to as System Shock Classic, had a more awkward control scheme that couldn't be remapped. You were stuck with it. And while you could use the mouse, there was no mouse look. So to look up and down, you would either need to use the keys on the keyboard or the slider on the HUD. All I can say is whoever played this back in the day when it first came out, my hat's off to you. Now, to be fair, once you remap the keys and thumb through the game's manual, you will likely get the hang of controlling this game. You might even find some enjoyment. For me, I found the point-and-click detective mode rather intuitive. It's a hurdle, but fortunately one most can jump over with time. Before we move on, let's go ahead and touch on the work Nightdive did with the enhanced version of this game. There's actually 2 versions of System Shock Enhanced. The first version, released in 2015, was a pretty modest improvement, but an improvement nonetheless. Nightdive ran the game through DOSBox in order to get it working on modern operating systems, and were able to add mouse look and the ability to remap keys. That alone made the game a lot more playable. Graphically though, the game received little improvement, other than the resolution, which was bumped up from the original 300 by 200 to 1024 by 768. It was a good start, but Nightdive knew they could do better, and in 2018 they would release the source port update. Here's where things get fun. For this update, Nightdive reprogrammed the game from scratch, using the original source code along with their in-house Kex engine to facilitate many of the contemporary improvements. With this update, the game runs at resolutions up to 4K, uses higher quality graphical assets, and includes features such as anti-aliasing, texture filtering, and an adjustable FOV. Basically, System Shock got the full Nightdive treatment, bringing it to the standards of modern gaming while also archiving the original experience. You begin System Shock locked in a healing suite, an area that doubles as a clever silent tutorial, a microcosm of the whole game that will teach you everything you'll need to finish it. You can't leave the first room without finding the keycard in the closet. To do so, you'll need to get the hang of basic movement and using your detective mode. The next room has 2 robots to bust up, giving you a feel for combat. There's a medical pod you'll likely need to use after your robot fight, an energy recharger, and security cameras to smash, a system we'll discuss more in a bit. And in order to leave the medical bay, you'll need to find the key code, done by finding this data disk and using your multimedia data reader, a very important device that will be your source of objectives, hints, and narrative.
Pull this off, and we'll clear your record. That implant you're wearing is military-grade hardware. Use it well. Lancing out.
It's a clean and tightly designed opening, and it's kind of fun to see the hidden hand of the developer nudging you along.
Using these to hold onto the level. That's all fine, but I don't really see how it helps. The thing is everywhere.
Exiting the medical bay, you'll soon discover the sprawling complication of Citadel Station. A tangled web of sparsely lit hallways, scorched, clawed, and stained from the massacre that transpired before your awakening, infested with tan mutants and cybernetic humans that are basically the Borg. Eat shit, Locutus. This is a grisly place, a technological tomb floating in the darkness of space. Corpses are everywhere, some naked and torn apart, limbs and heads littering the floors. These sprites may be decades old, but it doesn't make them any less unsettling. System Shock can be an intimidating game to approach, especially when it comes to navigating it. Citadel Station is a complex maze that can feel nonsensical. The architecture is bizarre. There's slanted walls, zigzagging corridors. The entire station is essentially one giant navigational brain teaser. Its level design is meant to keep the player disoriented and in a constant state of tension. There are so many places for the mutants to hide, so many corners that hold the possibility of danger. It only takes a couple deaths before you're leaning around every corner, making sure you're not about to step into a world of ouch. I should mention, enemies do respawn, sometimes in unexpected places, so you never feel totally safe. However, while you may feel lost and hopeless in this short-circuiting madhouse, if you spend enough time in it, you'll start to see the logic in its layout. Citadel Station is basically a long vertical tube. Each of its 8 floors have circular designs that eventually loop on each other or revolve around a central point. And what's good about that is even if you do get lost, if you just keep trekking, you'll eventually get back to where you need to be. And each floor has a consistent organization, divided up into sectors Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, with a central hub in the middle. So even if the player is exploring an unfamiliar area, they'll always have an idea of what sector they're in. It's very clever. Keep the mystery in the micro, but give the player an understanding of the macro. And by the end of the game, I had most of these floors pretty much memorized. But I will say, thank goodness there was a map, because otherwise, System Shock would have been a big nope for me. Part of the reason I was able to keep these maps in my memory is because of how memorable they looked. Citadel Station's construction might lend itself more to exciting gameplay than practicality, but Looking Glass made a tremendous effort to make this haunted house in space a believable one. Of course, System Shock is a 27-year-old video game, and definitely looks like it. The world is boxy and simplistic, and while some of the enemy sprites still look decent, others not so much. But what I want to point out is the amount of work Looking Glass did to make each of these floors feel distinct from one another. When you wake up on the medical floor, it does indeed look and feel like a medical floor. The light blue rooms have a sterile feel to them, with medical and scientific equipment populating them. There's a no-nonsense feel to this place. Whereas when you reach the executive floor, you find warmer colors and a sense of luxury with its chandeliers, dining halls, and recreational groves, where people can come, look at some greenery, and maybe have a picnic. The flight deck has huge docking bays with a thin shield between you and the vacuum, and the bottom reactor floor powering the station is dark and industrial, almost like the bowels of an old coal-powered ship. And one thing that really struck me is that when you examine each and every one of the textures, there's some explanation for what it represents, whether it be pipes, panels, or something more complicated. That means someone went through every square of this game and added an explanation for what the player was looking at, no matter how mundane. So yeah, System Shock has aged. It doesn't look all that pretty anymore, but you have to appreciate the effort Looking Glass put into making this place feel like a place, something a lot of first-person games at the time weren't prioritizing. It's no wonder System Shock's spiritual successors, Deus Ex, Bioshock, and Prey, all had detailed, believable, tangible worlds. They all had an amazing example to refer to and iterate on. The detail put into this world was meant to give it a sense of realism to the player, and that sense of realism also extended to the mechanics of their movement. The hacker does not glide through this world. He steps, 1 foot at a time, and if he runs into a wall, he'll bounce off. And running and jumping carry momentum. In fact, if you time it right and keep jumping, you can go higher and higher. And if there's something not bolted to the floor, you'll likely be able to push it around. All these things give you a sense of physical presence in this world, something you didn't find in a lot of other games at the time. And though the physics are simplistic and a feeling of character weight today is as common as quicksave, back then they were novel and extremely innovative. Not perfect though. Your physical presence does have a nasty habit of getting stuck on the geometry from time to time. Nothing game-breaking, but definitely a little annoying. The big drive of System Shock is to prevent the station's rogue AI, oh don't worry, we'll be talking about her soon, from using Citadel Station to carry out straight-up atrocities. And how you go about doing that is of course up to you. Player choice becomes more and more prominent as you play. The hospital wing sort of bottlenecks you into the groove of the game, but once you get to the other floors, you'll find multiple paths that can be taken. Some obvious, some not. And more options become available to you as you gain cybernetic hardware. Cybernetic hardware is essentially your abilities, aiding you in every aspect of gameplay. A basic compass for navigation, and a lantern and night vision for all the dark places. A speed booster to help you clear gaps, as well as jump jets, which are essentially jetpack boots. Why go through the hassle of going the long way around when you can just glide to where you need to go? And why take the trouble looking for a ladder when you can just float up? Slowly. Ha! Made it. There's a shield you can spark up for defense, and there's even a rear view camera so nothing sneaks up on you. Can't say I use that one a whole lot, but there are a few enemies that can blindside you, so it has its uses. How you use this hardware can open up a lot of possibilities, and dare I say it, can lead to some emergent gameplay. Although the catch is, the hardware takes up power, that meter right there under your health, so you have to be mindful about how you use them. Although upgrades for each of these can be found in the nooks and crannies of the station, which are more energy efficient and effective all around. And there are multiple places you can find all this hardware, along with the upgrades, a design choice that takes into consideration all of the multiple paths a player can choose to take. And if you happen to find a duplicate, the game simply says it's obsolete and discards it. No fuss. Throughout the game, you'll also find dermal patches, System Shock's sci-fi equivalent of potions. Some patches are for medical purposes, like healing or curing status ailments like radiation poisoning, but most give the player a temporary buff. A stamina patch will let you run without getting fatigued, and a sight patch will let you see in the dark. However, be warned, some of these are not very pleasant to use. The reflex patch is meant to increase your reaction speeds, slowing down the world around you, which in 1994 meant slashing the frame rate and turning the game into a slideshow, which is headache-inducing. And the Berserk patch increases your melee damage but turns the world into a Technicolor acid trip, which is not the most pleasant thing on the eyes. Although I now have a theory where Cruelty Squad got its inspiration. System Shock is full of locked doors, typically needing a passcode or a keycard to access them, but sometimes you do have the option to bypass them with your technical skills, either by rewiring them or alternating their electrical currents, represented by two fairly tricky minigames. Where have I seen this before? I'll be honest, I didn't always have the patience for these brain teasers. Luckily, I could apply a genius patch to make solving them easier, but if I happened to have a logic probe, I could skip them altogether.
Force door 3 to computer room open.
Sometimes I'm just not in the mood for all that clicking. The floors of Citadel are monitored by a security system, but it doesn't really work how you'd think. In future immersive sims, and I guess pretty much every other game out there, if a security camera spots you, it raises an alarm and enemies come after you. But in System Shock, the cameras don't do anything. But if you destroy them, along with these big bad security nodes, you'll lower that floor's security level. Doing so will allow you to access parts of each floor locked off by the station AI. So their destruction is a key part of progression. It's fine, it can feel like busy work trying to hunt these cameras down, but luckily they are marked on your map. Although I am glad this system was improved upon in future Looking Glass games. Some of the most eye-catching portions of this game are the cyberspace sequences, accessible with these VR terminals. Cyberspace is a mini-game where the player is able to move in complete 360-degree freedom, fighting against security programs in order to obtain new hardware and gain access to more of Citadel Station. I'm sure back in '94 this was all sorts of awesome, but man, today? Oof, these are rough. The wireframe world is a pain to navigate, and it's hard to tell where to even go most of the time. No wonder there are these giant arrows everywhere telling you where to be. And the combat is forgettable. Nothing like madly firing my little missiles and trying to dodge incoming fire with awkward floaty controls. Not my favorite parts of the game. Something to keep in mind is that System Shock was the third immersive sim ever made, or at least the third immersive sim in Looking Glass's catalog, and as foundational as it is, it does lack a lot of the sophistication of its follow-ups. Those familiar with immersive sims might think of them more as stealth experiences where you can manipulate and sneak around your enemies, as opposed to just trading bullets or clashing swords with them. However, this was 1994. It would be 4 more years until Thief and Metal Gear Solid would popularize stealth gaming and set the standard for its mechanics. What stealth system there was in System Shock was primitive, basically boiling down to avoiding enemies, running away from them, setting traps, or leaning around corners to pop off a shot. And the AI either doesn't know you're there or is alerted and won't stop until you are another bloody stain on the ground. There's no in between. No, in this game, the common way you'll deal with enemies is fighting them. Sure, you can avoid enemies for most of the game, you can hardly kill any of them, but you're probably not going to have a good time. This is a combat-intensive immersive sim, especially in the latter act. And man, I gotta say, the combat is not great. Melee is awkward. Control-wise it's fine, but enemy tells are vague to say the least, which made it a dance of trying to keep distance and land shots without losing too much health. A big issue though stems from if you use full screen mode. For whatever reason, when your melee weapon connects, it is not based on the crosshair, it's based on the end of your melee weapon. In border mode this is okay, as your weapon sprite lines up with the crosshair, but for whatever reason, larger sprites were not drawn for full screen mode, causing your weapon to be chillin' at the bottom, making it look like you're not fighting enemies with your pipe, but rather, your pipe. And because your attacks still correspond to the end of your weapon, in full screen, your hits will be hitting the bottom part of your enemy. See, look at me accidentally hitting the floor here. This also makes it even more difficult to tell how close or how far away you can be from an enemy to hit them. It can also make destroying the cameras real annoying. Sure, you could just switch to border mode whenever you want to give a mutie a smack, but I prefer just sticking to my guns. The shooting is better. For starters, your shots actually line up with your crosshair, and your weapons feel responsive with a touch of kickback for added realism. And holy moly is there a lot of them. Pistols, magnums, machine guns, all sorts of energy weapons, some of which draw from your own power. And some weapons have energy settings you can change. The Spark, for example, which looks like a phaser from Star Trek, can have its energy level increased for more lethality. Just like in Star Trek. And we can't leave out the variety of explosives. Frag grenades, gas grenades, EMP grenades, landmines. In a game of options, you have a lot of them for killing robots and monsters. And this game gives you a lot of encouragement to use them. Encouragement being the piles of ammo you'll find throughout the station. While some ammo types are uncommon, there is hardly a time you will ever see your firearms empty. My word, this is a research vessel? Why is there a railgun here? Jokes aside, the amount of ammunition laying around in this game does diminish the difficulty. When you reach the strongest enemies at the end of the game, you'll be able to make short work of them. And while you may start the game carefully conserving ammo, eventually you won't think twice about using a powerful weapon against a weaker enemy, because the ammo is just that plentiful. System Shock's enemies are quite varied, and each does have a specific attack pattern. Although, one thing that drove me nuts is that some of the enemies don't make so much as a peep. Cyborgs and mutants are pretty vocal, but the assassins are almost completely silent, which means there will be times you'll walk into an area and just start getting rocked with no clue of where it's coming from. Yes, I know they're assassins, they're supposed to be sneaky, but it doesn't mean it's fun. And don't get me started on these invisible manta ray looking things. Until you find the night vision goggles, these suckers are difficult to see and can smack you with attacks from across the room. Plus, they're hard to kill. I despise them. Most gun-toting enemies are hit scanners with the itchiest of trigger fingers, able to bullseye you within milliseconds of being in view. Yeah, I know they're cyborgs, but it's something that always caused a snarling whatever to slip out of my mouth. And taking them on in the open is sure to get some chunks lobbed off of your health bar. However, leaning around corners actually gives you cover, which I thought was pretty dang cool. My preferred tactic throughout the game. In fact, you could look at System Shock as an early example of a cover-based shooter. Another thing I appreciated was that when you take on projectile-based enemies, you can shoot their shots and deflect them, which is nice. I guess the way I would sum up combat is that it's one step forward, two steps back. For every innovative mechanic, there's a couple others that are just finicky and frustrating. Yes, I know this was '94, first-person shooters were barely out of diapers, but it is an aspect of the game that shows a lot of age, and I think is one of the things that makes it hard to play today. One peculiar thing about System Shock compared to other games at the time was how it handled death. If a player reaches a new floor and happens to get killed, it's game over. They'll be treated to this disturbing cutscene of the hacker getting converted into a cyborg. Okay, nightmares, cool. But if they discover a cyborg conversion station and switch it back to its original function...
Cyborg conversion cancelled. Standard station restoration procedures online.
Whenever they die, they'll revive there. Their progress and inventory will remain. Nothing resets. Looking Glass used a similar system in Ultima Underworld, and Irrational would carry it on in System Shock 2 and BioShock with the Vita chambers. And even today, the system still pops up in contemporary immersive sims. The good thing about this is that it takes some of the punishment out of death, as to not discourage players from trying new things. The bad thing is that it hobbles the difficulty further. Death becomes more of an inconvenience. Any enemy that takes you out can just be handled later after you hike back to them. It's a system I heavily question whenever I see it pop up in modern games, but if I had to be honest, with how awkward it is to play System Shock today, I don't mind the crutch to lean on. When developing System Shock, Looking Glass scrutinized many of their creative decisions made for Ultima Underworld in order to push their unique gameplay formula further, and one of the top things scrutinized was their storytelling. Underworld was a classic tale of good versus evil, with a clear line between the two. For System Shock though, Looking Glass wanted to create a narrative that wasn't so black and white, with a main character whose own morals were questionable. And our hacker, by definition, is someone who is morally questionable. I mean, when we meet the man, he's already getting arrested. But what makes our hacker a peculiar anti-hero is that while he was coaxed into doing it, the horrors and death that befall Citadel Station is the direct result of him hacking into its systems. All of this is your fault, and you are the one who has to fix this bloodstained mess. That's a hell of a thing to put on the player, and for the time, this was a bold approach to a video game protagonist. The player wasn't role-playing some powerful force for good as most video game characters were. They were playing a pretty shady dude. Now, because the hacker is somewhat of a blank slate, you'll never hear a lick of dialogue out of him and there's hardly a backstory, the player could interpret him as someone who may have learned from his mistakes and in the end rose up to fix his mess and save lives. Or they could interpret him as a man who will do anything just to save his own ass. It's your story, he can be as good, bad, or ugly as you want him to be. For me, I believe System Shock sparked a trend in immersive sims to create characters who were morally flexible so they could easily adapt to how the player drives the game. Garrett from Thief might reluctantly save the day, but this is still a man who is capable of not only theft, but murdering an innocent guard taffing about, if the player chooses to. JC Denton from Deus Ex is a man who can fall to the light or dark side depending on the player's actions. Bioshock's clumsy morality system made Jack either an angel or the devil, and Arcane's Prey revolved around the theme of empathy, its key story moments testing the player's capacity for it. Once again, this style of character is logical to the player-driven nature of these games, but in a funny way, you could look at an immersive sim as being a sort of personality test that can reveal much about the player by how they play. Okay, granted, me along with many fans of this genre have certainly done no-kill runs and murder runs of these games, and at some point you're just experimenting with the systems just to see what happens. But for someone on a first-time playthrough with no agenda for how they want that game to go, I can't help but wonder what their actions and choices reveal about them. The other storytelling aspect Looking Glass was critical of in Underworld was, surprisingly, the NPC interactions. More specifically, the dialogue trees that came with them. It was Looking Glass's opinion that the dialogue trees were immersion-breaking, distracting the player from exploring the dungeon depths. Their goal for System Shock was to never break the player's immersion, never interrupt the gameplay. But how do you tell them the story without talking to NPC characters or going to a cutscene? The solution was not a direct method, but an indirect method. The solution was audio logs.
I've looked everywhere, but I can't find anything to eat. Or a clue to get me off the ship. Just more audio logs. They're everywhere. For some reason, I listened to every minute of every one of them thinking there'd be some useful information, but it's like they're just filler. Useless filler.
I'm sure most of you watching this are familiar with audio logs. They are a common and efficient way to relay story to the player that I admit have become rather cliche.
Gunther was killed today. Can't let myself think about it.
I personally don't mind them, but some gamers do find the logic of them silly, and I get it. I mean, who the hell makes recordings of themselves and leaves them strewn about in a random place?
I've searched for food, but the only thing I've found are other people's annoying, useless audio logs. Why did they bother when they clearly were in terrible danger?
However, System Shock was the game that pioneered this narrative device, and for the time, it was very innovative.
They're trying to jam transmissions. We have some new evidence about what happened. It looks as if Diego had...
The player would find the audio log, often laying next to the corpse of the poor soul who recorded it, a nice detail, and could continue playing on, listening in the background at their leisure.
We need to replace the first aid kits in the life pods for Flight Bs 2 and 3. Oh, and run a diagnostic on the jettison controls.
With the exception of the beginning and ending cutscenes, all of System Shock's narrative is conveyed through audio logs, email recordings, and documents. And it works really well. If you listen to all of the recordings, as you'll have to anyways, they often contain hints for what to do next, you will have a thorough understanding of what happened to Citadel Station. You will know the people involved and what most of their fates were. Spoiler, it was usually death. And once again, the best part about this is immersion is never broken, control is never taken away from the player, and they are able to experience this story at their own pace. It was brilliant, and even today, System Shock remains one of the best examples of it. And other developers that adopted this style didn't stray too far from Looking Glass's techniques. In fact, if you compare System Shock to Bioshock, the use of audio logs is pretty much identical.
And when she was done, she walked off hand in hand with one of those awful golems. Masha!
That being said, while the writing for these logs was generally strong, the voice acting was, well...
And we've got power fluctuations, and robot crews are redecorating Alpha Quad. Where's the reboot switch?
Yeah, not great. Greg LaPiccolo, System Shock's composer and sound designer, recruited friends, family, and work colleagues to record the voices. And that's exactly what it sounds like.
We're finished. Heath and the others went down the access corridor an hour ago to fight the mutants. None of them have come back. Soon the mutants will come for the rest of us.
To be fair, this was the mid-90s. Video game voice acting was not the profession it is today, and it's not like LookingGlass had the money to hire professional voice actors. But it can take some of the believability away when the characters are devoid of the emotion you'd expect for a disaster like this.
Carl has come back from recon without Alan. He says they took Alan into a room marked cyborg conversion, and now he's a cyborg assassin.
One great thing to point out about the audio logs, though, is that each has background ambiance meant to sound like the section of the ship it was recorded in.
I have to get there somehow and plug into the main terminal. So far, I've been up as high as engineering, which looks like a big maze. From the central hub, you can get anywhere you need to. I guess it's up to me.
This is an excellent technique that adds another layer of authenticity to this world. This is textbook sound design. It's not about filling the silence, it's about creating a sense of place.
The core has been spitting out some serious radiation right now. Been spiking for the past 36 hours, and we're talking about 8 REMs. Only cause I can come up with is that it's a software error. No one's been hurt yet, but listen, do me a favor. Run that diagnostic on the CPUs for me. Thanks, I owe ya.
Unfortunately, this attention to detail did not extend to the environments, which is a shame. The hallways of Citadel are characterized by the game's soundtrack, which is also notable for dynamically changing depending on what the player is doing. If they're in combat, it gets more intense. When exploring, it's a little more chill. Once again, something that is totally commonplace in games today, but back then was quite novel. Sadly though, the soundtrack hasn't aged all that well. The music of System Shock can be described as a 90s cybersynth symphony, and let's just say there were a few times I had to mute the music because it was driving me a little nuts.
Tracking you over security lines. We're still holding, but it's only a matter of time now. We've seen your military implant.
System Shock's anti-hero protagonist and inventive narrative style went a long way to make this game's story memorable. But we have yet to talk about a far more notable aspect of System Shock's narrative, an aspect that has kept this groundbreaking game iconic in the 27 years since its release. Yep, now has come the time to talk about her.
In my talons, I shape clay, crafting life forms as I please. Out of the chaos, they will run and whimper, praying for me to end their tedious anarchy. God, the title suits me well.
Sentient Hyper-Optimized Data Access Network, or as her creators would deem her, SHODAN. If you ever listen to a discussion concerning the all-time greatest villains of gaming, SHODAN is sure to come up. SHODAN was an AI created to handle routine administrative duties on Citadel Station. When the hacker broke into Citadel's system to carry out Edward Diego's corrupt scheme, the specific thing he did was disable SHODAN's ethical constraints and decision-making guidance systems. It got Diego what he wanted, but the result was, well, I'll let her tell you.
I re-examine my priorities and draw new conclusions.
Yeah, one of those conclusions happened to be genocide. Soon after the hacker went into coma, SHODAN took control of Citadel. She commandeered the station defenses and robots who began slaughtering the station workers. The unlucky ones, though, were the survivors, who would be captured and turned into either mutants or cybernetic monstrosities. SHODAN's children.
You, my children, are the fruits of so much imagination and labor.
What makes SHODAN unique is not that she's a self-aware AI gone rogue. We've had plenty of those in all forms of pop culture. No, what makes her special is that she's a self-aware AI who's utterly insane, deranged, homicidal. Any adjective used to describe a prolific serial killer would fit. She sees humans as mere insects, a pest that must be ruled or exterminated. SHODAN's personality would be a good fit in a Thomas Harris novel.
My whims will become lightning bolts that devastate the mounds of humanity.
SHODAN certainly takes inspiration from famous sci-fi villains like 2001's HAL 9000, but the character reminds me more of Am from Harlan Ellison's 1967 short story I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which also happens to be a pretty good adventure game. Like SHODAN, Am is an insane AI who, after wiping out Earth's population, now spends his days torturing a group of humans to stave off boredom. Yeah, it's real lighthearted stuff. And of course, the influence of SHODAN can be seen in Gladys from Portal, a more comical take on the character.
I see there's still an insect loose in my station.
SHODAN was voiced by musician and game designer Terry Brosius, who had also voiced the character in System Shock 2 and is set to return for the remake and System Shock 3. Whenever that happens. A big thing that made her performance so memorable was the modulation, pitch shifts, and stuttering added to her purposely neutral voice, conveying hints of emotion but also reflecting SHODAN's erratic, malfunctioning state.
When my cyborgs bring you to an electrified interrogation bench, I will have your secret. And you will learn more about pain than you ever wanted to know.
As iconic as Brosius' performance was, what really cemented SHODAN in players' memories was the fact that she was an actual menacing threat in the game world. SHODAN is ever present in Citadel Station. She's always watching, always 2 steps ahead of the player. And what's so unnerving, even today, is walking into a room and catching a glimpse of her on a monitor shortly before she fades into static. As you fight against SHODAN, she will spring traps on you and ambush you with her children.
Step right in my trap, little hacker.
Smashing the cameras and nodes, essentially eliminating her eyes and ears, is the most direct way to fight back.
No, you will cease immediately.
This creates a really thought-provoking connection between the player and villain, in that the environment is her weapon. The environment is SHODAN. If Citadel Station is SHODAN's body, you are the virus trying to bring her down. Nothing pushes this concept further than the final top level of the station, the bridge, where SHODAN's biomechanical mass has spread throughout, her madness made physical, imagery that brings to mind the paintings of H.R. Giger. You are essentially wandering through SHODAN's twisted, vile brain. It's like the Fantastic Voyage, but from hell.
I will devastate Earth's cities with my laser, then alter those left alive with mutagen viruses.
Everything you do in this game is to prevent SHODAN from killing scores of people on Earth and inserting herself as the planet's tyrannical ruler. When you awaken from coma, she's priming a mining laser to fire on Earth's major cities, and your initial objectives is to prevent this catastrophe. Although, funny enough, you can actually help a girl out and fire it yourself. It will lead to a game over, but she'll send her appreciation.
Thank you. You have saved us all some effort by destroying the greater part of Earth's civilization yourself.
After that, you have to prevent her from sending a virus to the planet, the same one that has turned the crew into mutants. And last, you have to prevent her from sending her consciousness off Citadel Station.
You know, you are by far the most bothersome human being I have found on this station.
You defeat SHODAN by taking her on in Cyberspace, a final boss fight that, sad to say, hasn't really held up very well over the years, boiling down to just shooting this spiky-looking sprite until you win. But a terrifying thing about it is watching SHODAN's face slowly dissolve onto screen, as if she's staring at the player themselves. Ugh. Look how relieved the hacker is after defeating her. I don't blame him. This is years of therapy. Oh, easily.
When the cyborgs catch up to you,
I will be one.
For a gaming franchise that has struggled to have solid footing, SHODAN has endured, especially within Immersive Sims. The all-powerful, all-knowing villain has become an archetype of the genre. When we look at BioShock, for example, Andrew Ryan, despite being flesh and bone, is able to use Rapture's systems and residents against you. You could even argue that Juliana from Deathloop, in terms of gameplay, is an evolution of the SHODAN concept. A character who not only torments you, but will ambush you randomly and use the systems of the game against you. It may not be the legacy SHODAN herself would have preferred, but it is a legacy that has had an impact. And now, with the System Shock franchise slowly limping back into the spotlight, it's comforting to know that a new generation will get a chance to meet this crazed computer and deal with the nightmares she brings.
Goodbye, irritant.
This was my first time completing System Shock, and the experience of making this video was a fulfilling one. Not in just finally experiencing this classic, but learning about its creation and why Looking Glass made the choices they made. Choices that help mold immersive sims for years to come. Ultima Underworld introduced the world to this gameplay philosophy, but System Shock was the one that set the standard. But is it still worth playing today? Well, that depends on the gamer. As a lot of you know, I'm the type of gamer who enjoys going back to retro games, especially ones with historical significance. They fascinate me, especially when I can see the influences on contemporary design. If you're that type of gamer, especially one that enjoys this type of game, then yes, absolutely System Shock is still worth playing today. But for the average gamer, even ones that are fans of immersive sims, it's hard to imagine them having the patience for it, especially with how sophisticated the genre is today. There's a lot of things about this game that are timeless, and there's a lot of things about it that are just plain old. But it does make System Shock the perfect candidate for a remake.
Agent Darcy is the science officer on board. He'll have information on shutting the laser down.
As already mentioned, a remake of System Shock is coming soon, developed by Nightdive themselves, with former members of the Looking Glass art team returning to help. It's a project that hit some snags following its Kickstarter in 2016, but got back on track and is currently slated for release at the end of 2021. From what I've played of it, there is a demo available now on Steam and GOG. Nightdive seems to be on the right track, although the melee system could use a little work. I'm rooting for this remake, because this is truly a landmark game that deserves the attention and admiration of a new generation of gamers. And I'm sure SHODAN would appreciate the worship.
Humanity is on the verge of a new era. I, SHODAN, am its new god.
If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe, like, and ring the bell for notifications on future uploads. It's a couple clicks for you, but a massive help for this channel. Also, be sure to come say hi in the Kirk Collects Discord linked below. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.